When someone with avoidant attachment patterns senses that a meaningful relationship is truly slipping away, not for a short time, but in a way that feels permanent, they may shift into a final relationship strategy often called the vulnerability bomb. This is not a slow change that develops over weeks or months. It is a sudden and dramatic shift where emotional openness seems to appear almost overnight. Thoughts, feelings, fears, and personal experiences that were carefully hidden throughout the relationship are suddenly shared all at once. What makes this experience so confusing is its timing. It rarely happens during peaceful periods when the relationship feels secure. Instead, it often appears when the avoidant person realizes that their usual pattern of emotional distance, mixed signals, inconsistent communication, and pulling away is no longer having the same effect. The other person has stopped chasing. They are no longer constantly explaining themselves or trying to repair every misunderstanding. Instead, they are beginning to detach, rebuild their own life, and move forward. That is often when the avoidant response becomes much stronger. When emotional distance no longer keeps the connection alive, a different strategy may emerge. Suddenly, there are emotional confessions, honest conversations, and signs of deep self-reflection. This can feel shocking because it offers exactly what the other person had hoped to receive all along: emotional honesty, openness, and genuine connection. In that sense, the vulnerability bomb works as a psychological response to the fear of losing the relationship. It is not always planned consciously, but it can still be incredibly powerful. It offers the very thing that had been missing for so long, making it difficult for the other person to separate hope from reality. Stay with me, because what happens next explains why so many people mistake this emotional shift for lasting change. The sudden openness often changes the entire story of the relationship. Instead of believing the avoidant partner never truly cared, the other person begins thinking they were simply afraid, overwhelmed, or carrying emotional wounds that prevented them from expressing themselves sooner. That new perspective can be deeply emotional because it revives hope that had almost disappeared. It strengthens every reason the person once gave themselves for staying. They begin believing their patience finally paid off, that their consistency finally reached the hidden person beneath the emotional walls. One important psychological process behind this is called intermittent reinforcement. When affection and emotional closeness arrive unpredictably, after long periods of emotional distance, the brain can develop a stronger attachment than it often would in a consistently healthy relationship. The sudden emotional connection feels unusually meaningful because it interrupts a long period of emotional deprivation. As a result, recent emotional intensity can temporarily overshadow months or even years of inconsistency. The relationship is remembered through the emotional high of the present instead of the overall pattern that came before it. Another common feature of this stage is the sharing of deeply personal experiences. Childhood struggles, painful family relationships, past heartbreak, or long-hidden fears may suddenly be revealed. These conversations often feel incredibly intimate because they suggest a level of trust that was never shown before. The message seems clear: no one else has ever seen this side of me. For the person listening, this often confirms their long-held belief that there was always emotional depth beneath the distance. Their investment begins to feel worthwhile. Their patience appears meaningful. They feel they have finally reached the real person hidden beneath the protective walls. Whether fully conscious or not, this emotional opening also protects the avoidant individual in another way. Vulnerability arrives only when the relationship is already close to ending, allowing deep emotional expression without requiring months of sustained openness inside an ongoing commitment. That timing is one reason the experience can feel so emotionally overwhelming. What makes this pattern especially difficult is that it often appears exactly when the other person is finally beginning to heal. They are slowly regaining emotional clarity, recognizing unhealthy patterns, and creating healthier boundaries. Then suddenly they receive the emotional closeness they had wanted from the very beginning. One part of the mind remembers the inconsistency, while another responds powerfully to the emotional connection happening in the present. That internal conflict frequently leads to confusion, renewed attachment, or hesitation about moving forward. The vulnerability bomb is not simply about revealing emotions. It is about timing, renewed hope, and the powerful emotional impact created when openness appears just as someone was beginning to let go. These moments often generate tremendous sympathy and understanding, making it much harder to maintain healthy boundaries. Past behavior begins to look different because it is now explained through stories of fear, emotional overwhelm, or unresolved pain. The avoidant partner is no longer viewed primarily through the hurt they caused, but through the struggles they experienced internally. Another powerful element is the feeling of being uniquely chosen. When deeply personal experiences are revealed during this stage, the former partner may feel they have been trusted in a way no one else ever has. That feeling of exclusivity can strengthen emotional attachment, just as emotional independence was beginning to grow. Sometimes this shift also includes sudden promises about the future that sharply contrast with the relationship's earlier history. Discussions about living together, marriage, or lifelong commitment may appear after long periods of uncertainty. These feelings are often genuine in the moment because fear of losing someone can create an intense emotional awakening. Yet intense feelings are not always the same as lasting readiness for consistent intimacy. At the same time, the avoidant person may finally acknowledge behaviors they previously denied, offering detailed apologies and recognizing the emotional impact of their actions. For someone who spent months or years feeling unheard, this can feel like undeniable proof that real change has finally begun. Physical affection may also become noticeably warmer and more consistent, creating an even stronger impression that everything has transformed. The important question, however, is not whether these emotions are sincere in the moment. The real question is whether they remain steady through time, accountability, and everyday life after the immediate fear of losing the relationship has passed. Physical closeness can create an especially powerful emotional experience because it often reaches attachment systems before the rational mind has time to fully evaluate what is happening. That is one reason these moments can feel so convincing. Timing also plays an important role. This surge of emotional openness frequently appears when the avoidant person notices clear signs that the relationship is genuinely slipping away. Perhaps communication has become less frequent, boundaries have become stronger, the other person seems more confident, emotionally independent, or even interested in building a new life without them. Sometimes even subtle emotional distance is enough to trigger this response. Many people with avoidant patterns become highly sensitive to changes in emotional availability, even if they rarely express those feelings openly. When they sense their influence over the relationship fading, they may naturally become more emotionally expressive in an attempt to restore connection. This can happen when they see their former partner healing, becoming happier, or creating routines that no longer revolve around the relationship. Certain periods of life can also increase the emotional impact of these moments. Holidays, anniversaries, birthdays, stressful events, or seasons associated with loneliness often lower emotional defenses, making reconnection feel even more meaningful. Sometimes the avoidant person also reappears after noticing that their former partner is building new relationships or embracing a completely different chapter of life. That return can interrupt the healing process, drawing attention back toward the old emotional cycle, just as forward progress was beginning. Stay with me, because understanding what happens after this emotional shift is often far more important than the emotional moment itself. One of the most important things to recognize is that this emotional openness may not always represent lasting change. In many situations, it exists outside the avoidant person's usual coping style. It is often activated by the fear of losing the relationship rather than by a long-term ability to remain emotionally available. Once the immediate fear begins to settle, the emotional urgency that created the openness can slowly fade as well. Gradually, familiar patterns may begin returning. Emotional distance increases. Communication becomes less consistent. Openness becomes harder to access. Because this change usually happens little by little, it can be difficult to notice while it is unfolding. The memory of the emotionally intense period remains vivid, making each step back toward old habits feel confusing. Promises made during moments of emotional urgency may become more difficult to maintain during ordinary daily life. Sometimes the extra effort introduced during the crisis also begins fading. Personal growth, emotional reflection, or even professional support may lose momentum once the immediate fear of separation disappears. That is why consistency matters so much. Genuine transformation usually develops slowly. It remains steady whether the relationship feels secure or uncertain. It does not depend on emotional emergencies to stay active. Lasting accountability is measured through repeated actions, not powerful conversations alone. Real growth continues after the emotional intensity has faded. It is reflected in everyday choices, healthy communication, and reliable behavior over time. Emotional insight is valuable, but lasting change is demonstrated through consistency rather than moments of urgency. When someone decides to reconnect based mainly on this emotional surge, the experience can sometimes become even more painful than before. The sharp contrast between the warmth of reconnection and the return of familiar distance often creates deeper confusion than the original separation itself. After experiencing the closeness they had wanted for so long, losing it again feels less like continuing an old pattern and more like having something meaningful taken away. That emotional contrast can create self-doubt. People may wonder whether they misunderstood the situation, whether they expected too much, or whether the brief emotional breakthrough represented genuine long-term potential. Holding those two different versions of the relationship in mind at the same time often becomes emotionally exhausting. One version feels deeply connected, while the other feels distant and inconsistent. Trying to reconcile those experiences can weaken confidence in one's own judgment and make healthy boundaries feel less certain. That is why one of the healthiest approaches is learning to separate emotional intensity from long-term reliability. A powerful conversation, a heartfelt apology, or a brief period of closeness should not automatically be treated as proof that the relationship has fundamentally changed. Instead, it is more helpful to view those moments as one part of a much larger pattern. Lasting trust is rarely rebuilt through dramatic emotional breakthroughs alone. It grows through consistent behavior repeated across weeks, months, and ordinary everyday situations. Healthy relationships are not defined by their highest emotional moments. They are defined by the stability that remains after those moments have passed. When actions continue matching words over time, trust naturally returns. But when intensity repeatedly appears only during moments of loss, the pattern itself deserves as much attention as the emotion. Remember this above everything else. Consistency is what creates security. Repetition is what builds trust, and lasting change is measured not by how deeply someone feels in one emotional moment, but by how reliably they show up long after that moment is over. This approach helps protect someone from redefining an entire relationship because of one emotionally intense moment. Instead of allowing a temporary breakthrough to rewrite months or years of experience, it creates space to observe whether meaningful change continues in everyday life. Many relationship patterns can produce brief periods of closeness when emotions are running high. Lasting growth, however, shows itself through steady behavior long after the crisis has passed. Another helpful perspective is separating personal growth from the outcome of the relationship itself. In other words, emotional awareness, accountability, and maturity only become meaningful when they continue whether the relationship is restored or not. A simple question can bring remarkable clarity. Does this change exist on its own, or does it only appear when there is a real possibility of losing the relationship? Genuine personal growth usually remains visible even when there is no immediate fear of abandonment, no urgent conflict to resolve, and no external pressure pushing someone to behave differently. When new behaviors disappear as soon as life becomes comfortable again, they may reflect the situation rather than a lasting internal transformation. This distinction matters because it reveals motivation. Fear-driven change often appears quickly during emotional emergencies and fades just as quickly afterward. Internally motivated change develops more gradually, but it continues even when there is no reward, no crisis, and no immediate need to prove anything. That is why patience becomes so valuable. Stay with me, because this next perspective may completely change the way you evaluate emotional breakthroughs in any relationship. One of the healthiest ways to protect your emotional well-being is by allowing time to become your greatest source of clarity. Instead of rushing back into the relationship the moment emotional openness appears, you maintain healthy boundaries while quietly observing what happens next. Think of it as creating an emotional observation period. During this time, you are not ignoring the other person's effort, nor are you immediately rejecting it. You are simply giving actions enough time to prove themselves. This makes it much easier to distinguish between a temporary emotional response and a stable pattern of behavior. Slowing the process also reduces the risk of becoming emotionally caught in the familiar cycle of hope, disappointment, and confusion. When emotions settle, patterns become easier to recognize. Looking at the relationship from a wider perspective often reveals that the issue was never one isolated event, but an ongoing cycle. One person gradually adapts to limited emotional availability, lowering expectations while continuing to hope for something deeper. Meanwhile, the other person moves between emotional distance and periods of renewed closeness, often when separation feels possible. Those brief moments naturally feel powerful because they interrupt long stretches of emotional absence. The connection feels stronger precisely because it has been missing. Over time, however, this pattern can quietly reshape perception. Emotional intensity begins to feel like evidence of lasting compatibility, even when daily behavior tells a different story. That is why learning to separate emotional intensity from emotional reliability becomes one of the most important skills in any relationship. Healing often begins with understanding your own emotional responses rather than judging them. This is not about blaming yourself for caring deeply. It is about recognizing why inconsistent affection can feel so powerful. When emotional closeness appears unpredictably, the mind naturally gives those moments extra importance. The emotional highs begin standing out far more than the longer periods of uncertainty, distance, or disappointment. Gradually, the brightest moments start shaping the entire story, even though they represent only a small part of the relationship. Recovery gently shifts that focus. Instead of asking which moments felt the strongest, attention turns toward what remained consistent across time, which behaviors appeared repeatedly, which actions stayed reliable regardless of mood, conflict, or emotional pressure. This wider perspective helps restore trust in your own judgment. Many people leave these relationships questioning themselves because they experienced moments that genuinely felt like lasting change before old patterns quietly returned. Rebuilding confidence means learning to evaluate relationships through repeated behavior rather than isolated emotional experiences. A meaningful conversation no longer erases months of inconsistency. A heartfelt apology becomes one important moment within a much larger timeline instead of a complete reset. At the heart of lasting clarity is one simple distinction. Temporary emotional activation often appears during moments of urgency, fear, or pressure. Sustained change continues long after those emotions have faded. When decisions are guided by consistent evidence instead of emotional peaks, hope becomes healthier. It is no longer based on possibility alone, but supported by repeated actions over time. That kind of hope is steady rather than fragile. It allows you to step away from repeating cycles and move toward relationships built on mutual effort, emotional consistency, and dependable care. In the end, lasting love is not measured by the intensity of its highest moments. It is measured by the quiet reliability that remains present every ordinary day.